All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And today, we're not going to talk about politics. We're going to talk more about a cultural issue. But before I bring my guest on, you got to remember to like this. You got to share this. You also have to subscribe. That way, you'll be notified whenever I upload a new episode. So hit that like, share, those like, share, and subscribe buttons like they did something to you personally. Also, check out my Substack. It's called Chasing Liberty. You can access that at libertychasers.com. Become a subscriber there as well and support my work. I highly appreciate it. So before I bring him on my guest, I'm going to kind of set it up a little bit. Now, I've had him on before. This is his second appearance because his first one was so interesting, especially when it comes to the world of dating, marriage, and relationships, and the world of that whole red pill community and all that good stuff. And it was very interesting, some of the things that they found out in their study. So without further ado, I'm just going to bring him on. I have with me Mr. Paul Keable, Chief Strategy Officer for Ashley Madison, which some of y'all might have heard of. So y'all know this is going to be a little bit spicy. Welcome to the program, brother. Well, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate coming back.
Awesome, awesome. Now, before we go into the report that you guys put out, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Ashley Madison, all that good stuff?
So I work for Ashley Madison, and I've been with the company for a little over 10 years now. And one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is I get to talk to people like yourself to help people understand what's really happening behind the scenes at our company, and more broadly, what's happening in the world of non-monogamy, because we're led to believe one thing, and the truth is quite different.
Okay, okay. And just for those who are uninitiated, what is Ashley Madison?
Ashley Madison is the world's #1 married dating app for people looking to explore beyond the confines of traditional monogamy. In essence, if you're looking to have an affair and step out on your partner, whether they know or don't know, the discretion we offer and the community of like-minded people with more than 85 million members since we've been launched in 2002 makes us the perfect destination.
Yeah, so right there, that's already very interesting, right? That may shock some people. They probably didn't even know that there was a service that had 85 million users that is designed to help you cheat on your spouse, again, whether they know it or not. Very interesting and controversial. How long has Ashley Madison been around?
So we launched in 2002, so we've been around for a little over 20 years.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a long time. Yeah. Well, I guess nowadays it's not as hard to get business for that.
Well, there's a lot more options, and it's interesting with our latest report, which I know we'll get into shortly. People's views on monogamy and infidelity have shifted dramatically since we launched, and I find it fascinating about, in essence, people's embrace of it, or for a better way to look at it, more being more comfortable with it as an idea versus the flat out rejection that we would have had 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's very interesting and very instructive for any American who is, or really across the world, who's interested in this topic, because obviously marriage, relationship, family, all that stuff is very important. And for me, I mean, in your last appearance, it got me out of my comfort zone a little bit, and this one's going to make me uncomfortable too because I do have more conservative values, but I see the value in this report and other stuff that you guys have done because it can help folks like myself and even folks who don't have my values better understand how to navigate this stuff. So without further ado, let's get into the report. Now, what inspired you guys to even compile this report in the first place?
Well, one of the things, I face in doing my job as a very public person, going on podcasts and TV and radio, talking about what I do, I obviously get a lot of the criticism. And, I get it while I'm doing the interview. Sometimes I get it afterwards, people emailing me and finding my socials. And there's a lot of pent up anger, frustration, and critiques that are, I think, based on a lot of falsehoods or lack of understanding of what's happening. And so one of the things we do typically is talk about the truth about our members and their activities. But what's really interesting about this report is we really wanted to look from the different lens. What are Americans in the world, thinking about when it comes to infidelity? How do they view their partner's potential acts of infidelity? And is it something you'd be willing to forgive? Because And this was really the impetus in a way, because I often will say, we probably save more marriages than we end, which causes a rise, and people get very frustrated that I say this thing, like, how can an affair possibly save a marriage? And if you spend enough time talking to me, I can explain it. But what we want to do is, how do other people view this? And we ask thousands of people around the world, would you be willing to forgive your partner if they committed an act of infidelity? And the results were very surprising.
So yeah, so what was most surprising about these results?
I think the biggest surprise for me was that the gender split was not as great as I anticipated. Looking at Americans specifically, it was, I think, 47%, 44% of women would forgive their partner if they committed an act of infidelity, and 47% of men said they'd forgive their partner for committing infidelity. I thought the split would be much, much higher, with women being far less likely to forgive the act. But the reality is, I should know better, because I spend all day talking to my members, particularly the women, to get the insights. And I think people are coming to the realization in this day and age, for your partner to be your best friend, your lover, your economic partner, often your co-parent, and to fill all of these needs and burdens is a lot for one individual person. And so we're finding that infidelity, or for the sake of argument, non-monogamy, is increasingly becoming an acceptable part of people's relationships, simply because people are realizing the constraints of traditional monogamy.
Yeah, and I think the term non-monogamy is important because realistically, a lot of people, if they step out on their spouse knows about it, and it's something that they've talked about. That's what we talked about on our first conversation. Because a lot of people, especially among younger generations, Gen Zers, they're more open to non-monogamy. But what surprised me about the report is kind of what you said, but for a different reason. For some reason, I would have assumed that men would be less likely to forgive cheating than women would. Um, so why is that not the way I thought it was?
Well, I think a lot of it goes to understanding why the genders usually commit acts of infidelity. And
Okay.
in understanding the rationales behind it, because we have a perception that is often portrayed in Hollywood, religion, society tells us that men are the cheaters because they have these high libidos, and they just want to, spread their seed as large and as wide of a path as possible.
They
And
just keep
women are
going.
these emotional, vulnerable people, and they're cheating for revenge or for emotional reasons. But here's the interesting thing. We actually partnered with the University of Missouri, a researcher named Dr. Alicia Walker. And this was a study that she conducted independently using our database. So it was not paid for.
Okay.
Just to, give you a sense that this wasn't something that we asked her to do. She came to us. She really wanted to understand, why did women cheat and why do men cheat? Because there is this perception, and she wasn't sure if it was the truth. And it turns out what we think is the complete opposite. In her study, 80% of the women on Ashley Madison were cheating because they were in a sexless or orgasmless marriage. In
Mm.
essence, they were outsourcing their intimate needs to Ashley Madison. And what's fascinating is the next level of that data tells us, and I've had this conversation, so I know this to be true. Majority of these women would tell you they love their partner, they love their family, they love their whole life except for that one aspect, and they're unwilling to compromise on it. And so, in doing this and taking this action of joining Ashley Madison and having sex with other men who are not their husband, they'll come back and they'll tell me, I've heard this so often, I'm a better mother, lover, and wife because of my affair, because my needs have now been met, and I can, lower the stress level. But fascinating is why men cheat. The majority were cheating for emotional reasons, emotional validation. They didn't feel wanted or desired any longer in their relationship. And while that will often manifest in a physical way, it was the emotional need of being told you are desired, you are wanted, and that they felt was missing from their primary relationship. And that is really the flip of what society really thinks is going on in the world of adultery.
Yeah, and the thing, and we talked about that the first time, and when you explained it, it made a lot of sense. I mean, because men do want that validation, whether they want it every day or just at least it's to a certain extent, they want to feel wanted, they want to feel heard, they want to feel understood. It kind of reminds me of this skit that I always see on social media where this guy is driving his car to an area where it looks like there's prostitutes, and one of these prostitutes comes up to his car and basically she offers, I'll let you win an argument with me for this amount of money. And then he says,
I've seen it.
you've seen it, yeah. And then before she gets in the car, she's like, for 50 bucks extra, I won't even criticize your driving. And then they go to the hotel room, and he's like talking about how he wants to spend holidays with his family, and she lets him win the argument. I think it makes sense, though. It was funny, but it kind of speaks to another reality. I think men, as much as we're represented as just primarily sexual beings, there is an emotional aspect there. And it makes sense that that would kind of contribute to men cheating versus why women cheat. But the report, something that the report said that I thought was interesting is that nearly half of Americans are open to forgiving infidelity. Do you have any idea what the data was like before this report, like say 10 years ago or 5 years ago? Is this an increase or
it's a really hard one to assess, because I think, we understand infidelity often through the lens of pop culture, through our religion, sometimes our government. And so we have these misconceptions, and that's why we do these studies, to sort of shed light on what we might have perceived. Because I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said 90% of the population would say they would never forgive. Right. But here's a little interesting stat. Ask yourself, ask your friends, how many people within your social circle over the past 20 or 30 years do you know that have had infidelity appear within the relationship, yet the relationship still stood? They maintained the marriage. They went through a tough time. Yeah. And this is what I say, that infidelity can save a marriage. And it's hard for people to grasp that. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best choice or the only choice, but it often forces hard conversations, because sometimes a partner will say, listen, Jeff, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. I really am missing this. I need this. And you're like, yeah. You don't listen. You don't hear. You don't act. And so your partner might do, we work with a marital therapist called Dr. Tammy Nelson. Mm-hmm. Some people commit acts of infidelity called a can opener affair. They intend to get caught to their partner because they want their partner to realize how serious they were about the issue, about whatever was missing, and they'll force these hard conversations. And this is how marriages sometimes evolve and can get better through an act of infidelity, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but it's a truism. So if you asked me 10 years ago what people thought, I don't know. But I think, honestly, if people answered truthfully, I think this data would have held up even 10 years ago.
Yeah. And now that I think about it, I think you're right. I mean, I have known people who have gone through that, and I would probably say most of them ended up figuring out how to work it out and move past it. And, I think I like the way you put that, because it's not necessarily that cheating is a good thing, but good things can come from bad things, right? Like sometimes if we do something wrong or if something bad happens to us, it's really not about what happened. It's about how we move forward with it, how we respond to it. So if this is the case, then why are so many people willing to forgive cheating when that kind of counteracts the prevailing wisdom?
Well, I think it's a couple things. In part, I think it's an internalization of their own understanding of themselves, meaning they understand they have the capacity for the same act. You would be hard pressed to walk down the street and not notice a beautiful looking person who fits all the criteria of what you consider attractive. And look at that person, you might have thoughts and desires. And if you being honest with yourself, you're going to say, you know what, my partner probably does the same thing. And so when we look at these acts, it's hard for people to say with absolute honesty, there is zero circumstances where I would cheat. I'm not saying everybody, but there's a significant portion of the population that under the right circumstances, if they felt confident they weren't going to get caught, they would probably cheat. And in doing so, they acknowledge that their partner can have faults, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the end of a relationship, of a marriage. And in doing that, I think also we're now at a standpoint in society where we're realizing that our partner likely had partners before us. Mm-hmm. And that's a major shift if you consider, like, so I'm Gen X, so the boomer generation, my parents' generation, they view things very differently. And it's been not necessarily a lessening of morals, though I think some people would say that. I think it's an understanding of human dynamics and how we're designed to operate. And am I really willing to throw out 20 plus years of an amazing relationship simply because of one bad choice or a singular evening of activity that didn't, meet my approval, as it were, but my partner, got something from that? There's a whole range of emotions and decisions that go into that process. And often, I really believe this, that a lot of people come out better from a relation standpoint, having gone through this. And again, I'm not necessarily saying it's the best path to force that, but it is one increasingly people seek to take. Plus, you add on, as we talked about earlier, there's an increase in people just looking for non-monogamy with their partner's awareness, maybe not necessarily approval, but at least awareness.
Right.
And in doing so, we're stretching the concept of monogamy continuously. And that is also what fuels our interest in this space. We want to know more about this space. It's a really hard subject matter because when you ask the general population, hey, would you cheat? Did you cheat? They're going to all lie. No one's going to self-identify. But once you've already signed up to Ashley Madison, you kind of already let the cat out of the bag. So people are a little more honest in their reporting to us, I think, than they would be in a regular survey.
Yeah, and that does put you guys in a unique position to understand this, because you're right. The whole purpose for signing up is to cheat on your partner. So yeah, you're going to be more honest because you've already taken that step, right? So, but here's one thing that I wanted to ask about. The report refers to outdated attitudes on infidelity, which I thought was interesting and might even be a little bit controversial. So when it refers to outdated attitudes about infidelity, what makes typical views on this issue outdated?
Well, think about it from the starting point. In North America, Christianity is the majority religion, and it's the only sin in the Ten Commandments that's mentioned twice. So there's this view that really tells you how horrible infidelity is, right? It's one of the most venal sins you could possibly commit. They're going to hell for this, right? So people have this view that arbitrarily that if you're doing this, it's horrible. There's no excuses because it's based on a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, and a lack of data. Because most people assume infidelity is all the same, where the reality is affairs are very different from one person to the next. And I'll give you a really good example. We have a member, I remember speaking to a few years ago. So she was a lawyer, well-educated, obviously, a pillar in her community. She had married a man who was a little bit older than her. So at this stage, she was in her mid to late 50s, and her husband sadly had fallen into early onset Alzheimer's. So in essence, she had become his caregiver. She was never going to get a divorce. She didn't want to leave him, but because of her standing in the community, she had very few options to fulfill the physical parts of her life that were missing. And not just purely sex, but intimacy and closeness and connection, because that was taken away from her. And she didn't want to leave her husband. She wasn't going to divorce, but she couldn't sign up to a traditional dating app. People would see that and judge her accordingly. So she used Ashley Madison because of the discretion that we offer. And she found an amazing affair partner that fulfilled all her needs. And not only did that, manifest in her being a happier, gentle person, it allowed her to be the caregiver she needed to be for her husband because the stress of that was lessened. Unambiguously, by all statutes, that is infidelity, that is adultery. But I think most people, or I'd hope most people, would have compassion for her and understanding for her in terms of her act. And I'll tell you one other story quickly, because this is actually one of my favorite stories. And I can disclose this member's name because she's very public about her experience. We had a member named Bobby Goldman.
Okay.
And she was married to a tier A Hollywood producer. She ran her own businesses. So they were an affluent couple, lived a grand and amazing life. And he passed away. And now she's, at this time, I think in her early 60s, and she fell into a bit of a depression. And she was seeing a therapist, and the therapist said, hey, listen, you just need to get laid. And she's like, hey, you're right. So she signs up on all the traditional dating apps, and all the men in her age group are like, great, you can fold my clothes, make my lunch, do this. And they wanted a caregiver, and she didn't want that. So she signs up to Ashley Madison, starts dating all these married men, having great sex later in life. And it inspired her to write an off-Broadway play called The Curvy Widow, which was her username on the site. And what was fascinating is she's sleeping with all these married men, obviously in their 60s and 70s. Some of the partners she had introduced them to their wives, who said, you know what, thank God you're around to do that, because I don't want to do that anymore. So it's fascinating how she manipulated the concept of monogamy and stretched its meaning to have what she needed, but also give to a whole other couple what they needed. He got his needs. The wife was like, great, I didn't want to do that anyway. So everybody turned out to be happy. And I think that is what we talk about in terms of stretching people's understanding of what infidelity is. It's not always the horny business guy having an affair with the intern. That certainly happens, but that's not the single use case for Ashley Madison.
And I mean, I'm just listening to tell those stories. Like I feel my own cognitive dissonance going on right here. Maybe I have outdated attitudes, but I'm like you said, that like the first lady found an amazing affair partner. How is that amazing? That's what's going on in my mind when you're talking about this. And I'm just like, oh man, it's just that's very tough for me because I just I don't know. Like I can understand why. I mean, and the thing is, it's even though I feel uncomfortable with this idea, I can still have compassion for her. I understand why she did it, whether I think it's right or not. I get it. In the second story, it seems like that was more like consensual. In the first story, did the husband, well, he had Alzheimer's. Did he know what was going on, or how was?
No, he wasn't cognizant any longer. And
Uh,
so, no, it was a very, very much an affair. And the sad part about that story is I think, she still felt the shame and the guilt
mhm.
in taking these actions. But that's because society kept telling her that she was wrong. And
Yeah.
there's what I'm trying to do is not convince you, Jeff, to have an affair. I'm never trying to
Oh,
convince
I
people
know.
to have an affair. But what I do try to get people to say, try to understand it better and then make a judgment. Now, you're still going to tell me, listen, for you, it doesn't work. You find it immoral, unethical, and it's not for you. Great. Understand that. But you're at least coming at it from a basis of understanding and at least curiosity. So I actually
Yeah.
appreciate these conversations. And if I could convince a happily married couple to go have an affair, listen, my business would grow exponentially, but that's not the business that we're in. We're in the business of helping people who are already looking for this. We've built a better mousetrap.
Yeah, yeah, you did. And even though I'm going through all this cognitive dissonance right now, it's kind of yielded some positive results because it allows people like you to explain to other people why these things happen and help us understand it better. Like even that first story, even though I'm like, whoa, I kind of wanted to understand that better because again, if he had Alzheimer's, he wasn't able to meet her needs. I'm not saying it justifies it, but still there's more nuance to this than a lot of us have been conditioned to believe, right? Like you said, we think that cheating is a guy sleeping with his secretary or some woman sleeping with the pool boy, like in Desperate Housewives. And we just think that that's what it is, but that's not the reality. And I think the better we understand the reality, the easier it is for us to navigate these waters.
Absolutely. There's an ironic aspect to my job function talking about what's actually happening and using this data is as well as being the world's largest married dating app, we're also the world's largest marriage counseling service. Because if you don't want your partner on Ashley Madison, listen to me why they're coming here. Listen to me as to what's the reasons and the rationales and the causes of these actions. And you can then make better decisions within your relationship. I mean, in a perfect world, people would have these conversations long before, and we wouldn't have a need for Ashley Madison. We're going to sign up probably close to 3 million members this year. So clearly, we're offering something that is in high demand. And here's the funny part. I mean, I have seen data, external data outside of our domain, that says like 30% of people on other dating apps, traditional dating apps, are actually married people pretending to be single. And I'm like, that's horrible because you're creating a falsehood to some single person who thinks they're dating another single person, even if it's just a casual encounter. That's not the dynamic they're looking for. And we're like, no, come to us because there's other married people looking specifically for what you want to do. They have the discretion that you desire so that you're not going to get caught and you can have the types of conversations and and events in your life that you're missing with someone who's looking for the exact same thing. But nonetheless, this is why we continue to have these conversations and get out there to let people know there's better options for this pathway than what you've chosen.
So in your estimation, we're talking about outdated views on infidelity. How should people view infidelity? That's a
Well,
tough.
first, I think it's how should people view non-monogamy?
Okay.
Because I think that's an increasingly growing trend. And it's one that is, particularly in the Gen Z population, driving a lot of interest because people are looking at rejecting the traditional norms of relationships. And they're seeking out dynamics with willing, consensual partners that expand beyond what we are used to. Now, this isn't actually revolutionary, it's evolutionary. Again, I go back to my parents' world, the boomer world, or my grandparents' world, the greatest generation. The idea of premarital sex was like deeply foreboding. It was, that you are a horrible, immoral person. Now, the reality is, you go talk to these people, they were all still doing it. They just didn't talk about it. There was a belief versus a reality. And increasingly, the truth pushes the narrative away, and we start to realize what's happening. So in less than 2 generations, we've got to a point where premarital sex isn't just acceptable, it's almost expected. We want our partners to have experiences, and we want them to have the tools and skill sets to be good lovers by the time we get to the state of marriage or a permanent relationship. And Gen Z is now pushing that envelope to say, well, why do I have to have all these great experiences and participate in all these fun activities as a youth, 20s or whatever, and then suddenly decide, okay, I'm going to shut it all down and just do it with one person. They're saying, what's stopping me from having a committed relationship with one or more partners at the same time? Because what's different about sleeping with 10 people before I'm married or sleeping with 3 people while I am married? It's a logic exercise to a degree, and they're exploring the boundaries of it, which I think is really increasing people's understanding of relationship dynamics. And I think it's for the better, because the more open we are about our desires and needs, the better your relationship's going to be. And I think ultimately that will benefit society. When you take away the ideas of guilt and shame related to sex, we always end up in a better place.
Yeah, the report and the report talked about this, and then we talked about it before too. But the taboo behind this, and the just the misconceptions that we have, largely because we're not able to have conversations like you and I are having right now. I think that has made the problem worse because we're not being honest about these things. And I think that it's hard for me because I don't want to view infidelity as, yes, this is what we need to do, this is great. At the same time, I don't want it to be like we can't talk about it, because you can't address a problem or an issue without having that communication. So that's another positive aspect of this report, and really what a lot of what you guys are talking about. If you remove some of the taboo, now we can have conversations about it. And I think that's something that has been missing, which honestly I think is why it has led to a situation where so many people are choosing non-monogamy, whether it's consensual or not, consensual with the spouse, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. If I had any relationship advice for anybody, and the funny thing is, this isn't new. This is any therapist would have told you this the past 40 years. Have really good conversations with your partner. Be open, but not just open about what you want. Be receptive to your partner. And when they ask you or tell you that they're interested in something that you're adamantly not, don't shame them for that thought or belief.
Right.
Express your feelings that maybe it's not for me. Let's find a compromise. Let's find a solution to these problems. Otherwise, I'm telling you, and to my benefit, they will end up on Ash Madison seeking it without your consent or your knowledge. And that is, to me, is the biggest takeaway anybody can have from my business.
Yeah, so here's one thing. So this is kind of leading into the last question here, but in the report you meant Ashley Madison mentions that infidelity isn't always an exit strategy, like people looking to leave a marriage. Um, Now it's a way to supplement unmet needs. That's usually why people cheat. What would you say are let's say, the top 3 needs that don't get met that prompts people to step out on their marriages or relationships?
Well, I think so. If you're looking at it from the female perspective, the number one thing is good sex, and I think that issue has a couple different facets to it because, particularly in America, sex education is not very good. We're okay in the sense that we talk about, how to have quote unquote safe sex. So use a condom so you don't get pregnant, you don't get an STD. Okay, that's a good start. We're now a little bit evolving into issues around consent. I think that's fantastic. Really important part of the conversation. But what we never talk to our kids about, or the general population, is what is good sex? And people get into these really, traditional relationships, these monogamous relationships, sometimes quite young, and they have no idea about what good sex is for them, what their interests are. And when they start to bring it up, their partner recoils, thinking, "Oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not enough for you. So I got to shut this down because this means, you're a bad person, or you're going to make me feel bad about myself." Rachel Bilson, I bring this story up because I think it's very instructive. As a well-known Tier A Hollywood actress, and she was recently, I think it was earlier this year, maybe late last year, she revealed that she didn't have her first orgasm from sex until she was 30 years old.
Mm.
And so think about this. We have this absolutely stunning, beautiful woman who could have the pick of men around the world. And undoubtedly, she had probably great relationships with really nice guys, but none of them met her needs. And more likely than not, because she didn't understand what worked for her, because we live in a society that tells women don't have sexual desires. It's up to the man to dictate to a certain sense. And so good sex is the primary driver for women who end up having affairs. So men, ask your partner what works for them. Ask her to show you. Partake in that conversation in a really open way. And if it's something that you're not comfortable with, figure out a solution with her. Don't shut it down. It doesn't make you less of a man. Here's a real key thing. Toys are your friends, not your competition.
Okay.
And the last thing I'll say to the women, if you don't want your man on Ashley Madison, hey, every once in a while, look at him and say, "Hey, I really like that hat you're wearing, that shirt you're wearing." Compliment him on something. Tell him he did something good, because we so rarely get that in our relationships. We're told to be stoic. We're told to be the man of the house, provide, and that is sufficient enough for me to be a man. Well, guess what? We're humans. We're men, but we're humans first, and we all need a little bit of reassurance that you still love us, that we still are important to you, and that, there's an aspect of us beyond just being the provider that makes you happy that I'm in your life. If you do those two things, men and women, trust me, you'll have a far better relationship, and I'll be looking for a job.
Yeah. So here's the last thing I wanted to kind of explore with you, because when you were talking, it kind of made me think of something. Like, you were talking about, partners not shaming each other. We talked about the taboo surrounding non-monogamy. And I think, the prevailing wisdom for decades, since before either of us were born, is that, again, you don't really have these kind of conversations about infidelity. It's wrong. You shouldn't do it. And shame on you if you do, especially among Christians. I'm a Christian, and I can say Christians have used shame to enforce behavior, and Christians aren't the only ones. But I think we live in a society where it's just so much easier just to shame somebody for what they believe or for what they do than it is to understand it. The problem is that it doesn't. One, I think it's immoral to do that in most cases. I think sometimes shame does have its place, but not everywhere. So not only do I think it's not moral, it also doesn't work, because even in the Victorian era, where people were shaming infidelity, people were still doing it, right? People were still doing it all over the place. I think if we really want to change these things, and people who have these values need to be talking to people like you, Paul. They need to be having these conversations to better understand it. Instead of shaming, do the hard work of understanding what goes into this. Because I mean, a lot of what you said, as far as the unmet needs, that isn't talked about as much, especially because people aren't really honest about it. Like, I don't think most women who cheat, and not on Ashley Madison or elsewhere, they probably wouldn't admit that the number one reason is because they're not sexually satisfied. Because, like you said, our society has told them that that's not supposed to be important. On the other hand, society tells men, we got to be stoked. Who cares what your wife thinks about you? You shouldn't need compliments. You shouldn't need to feel validated. that has done tremendous damage. And I think with reports like yours and having these conversations, we can discover, well, wait a minute, maybe there's more to it here. We see the problem. When we can identify the problem, now we can do something about it. So I think overall, this could be a net benefit. Do you think that maybe we're on the precipice of redefining our understanding of relationships and monogamy and non-monogamy?
Well, I'll leave you with this. I think we're at a crossroads, particularly in America. America's leaning further into a very conservative culture.
Mm.
There is a strong push, and not just from the powers. I think there's a groundswell of people pushing towards a more conservative culture, which is neither good nor bad. It's a thing. But what comes along with that is often the shame and guilt associated with exploring conversations around sex and sexuality within the dynamics of a monogamous relationship. And what I would, counsel people is say you can lean into a conservative culture, but still have very strong and open conversations with your partner or potential partner to facilitate the type of relationship you want to have. Shutting it down, shying away from it out of fear, guilt, or shame almost always leads to activities you almost opposed. So don't take the path of least resistance, i.e., I'm not going to talk about it because it'll all go away, because that's why my business will flourish. There's a reason thousands of people are joining every single day. And trust me, it's not because people are being more open in their relationships. It's because people are being less open and they're not having the conversations.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thanks for coming back on. I mean, I'm sure we'll have you back on again because I'm sure y'all will be doing more reports, and this issue isn't going away anytime soon. So I think there's going to be a lot of room for a lot of conversation. So I appreciate you coming on with me again. Before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
You can find me at ashleymadison.com.
All right, but don't cheat on your wife and husband.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you.